Welcome to Taste Buds. I'm Debra Eckerling, ghost strategist, writer, and foodie. And today I'm speaking with Aaron Hamburger, a writer, a baker, and a babka maker. So very proud of myself for that one. Aaron, welcome. Good to have
Thank
you
you.
here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
We met because you wrote the babka recipe in Lesléa Newman's book, The Babka Sisters, and I previously had her on the show. And she said you need to meet Aaron. He is all about the food. So please share who you are and why she said that.
Great. So thanks again for having me, and hello to all your listeners. My name is Aaron Hamburger, and I am a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer and a food writer and a baker and a recipe maker. And food informs almost everything that I do. I grew up as a kid. I always loved food. My mom was a cook and particularly a baker. There were always like three desserts around, like on the counter, one maybe from a box, one like homemade, and then like maybe one sort of semi-homemade. And, it was just food was always something that was present in our lives. But one of the interesting things I think about food is that food also reflects history. Food also reflects values and the kind of food we eat and the kind of food that we're interested in at different times tells us about both who we are and sometimes what's going on in the culture at the time. Definitely, for example, the idea of making food from a boxed mix to me is like totally anathema, but in the 1970s, it was all about convenience. It was all about like saving time so you could go, self actualize and free yourself from the kitchen. So I just think it's interesting how these different trends, like foodieism, reflects how we are now versus like how we might have been in the past. So food is something that's always sort of been important to me. It's always run through my work. Interestingly, I could barely like boil water for a long period of my life. I was never like great at cooking. And then when my around the time my first book came out, I had a publicist. This is a book of short stories, and the publicist was on vacation for a week. And I asked my editor, "Where did he go?" And my editor said, "Oh, he went to cooking school for a week." And I thought, "That sounds amazing. Why don't I try that?" So I went to the Institute for Education in New York, and the bug just bit. And ever since then, I just started taking as many classes as I could, collecting cookbooks, and really, learning through trial and error how to do more than boil water. And then after a while, I thought, well, I have a certain repertoire of knowledge and I like to write. Maybe I can combine these two interests. And then I slowly started, folding them together. And here I am today.
So there is no food in that first short story collection, but in everything else is
Well,
what.
actually, it's funny that you say that. There's a lot of bad food in that collection, and I studied with the writer Mary Gordon, a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer, and she used to say bad food is endlessly interesting, and it's true. It's really there's a lot of creative possibilities in terms of describing how food can go wrong. So I really focused on that, and also it was set. The book is set in Prague right after the Cold War, when it was really difficult to find like fresh vegetables or fruit and things like that. So the chances of running into some bad food, frankly, were quite high. And so to accurately describe that milieu, the bad food kept coming up. A few readers were not happy with my depiction of the bad food scene. But what was interesting is I actually lived in Prague during this time. And I was teaching English and we had a break for Christmas vacation. And my friend and I were trying to figure out where to go that might like be open during Christmas. And we're like, oh, let's go to Israel. And so we went to Israel. This was in 1998. And I remember like biting into an orange and I felt like I had never tasted an orange before. Like just the freshness of the sort of Mediterranean cuisine, like really stood out after being sort of in Eastern Europe for all this time and eating things like tripe soup. So when my second book, Faith for Beginners, came out, it definitely featured sort of that sense of like light and air and the freshness of that food. So it's interesting. I think food's been present in all of my fiction, but just in different ways, often depending on like the places or topics that I'm writing.
I love the way you just described how food was inspiration, that bite. I am a former non-cook, so you and I were truly, truly destined to be friends.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about being a non-cook that becomes a cook is that you understand, how things can go wrong in the kitchen, and so when you're writing recipes, as I, frequently do, I'm thinking about, "Okay, what's the mistake that I would make? And how do I make this clearer?" Because, one of the lessons I learned early on when I was studying food writing per se, was that when a recipe goes wrong, it's always the recipe writer's fault. Like, you have to make it absolutely clear. And so, for example, when I was designing the, babka recipe for the Babka Sisters book that Lesléa Newman wrote, I had testers, and I had various testers from various walks of life, testers who were not Jewish, who had never tasted a babka, testers who were experienced in the kitchen, testers who were not experienced in the kitchen. And I really wanted to hear from them. Like, what did they not understand? Like, what did they get wrong? And then it's just amazing to me. I was working on this recipe and was pouring over it, pouring over it, pouring over it. And I had to design a double recipe because the book is about two sisters. One sister makes a chocolate babka, one makes a cinnamon babka, and they're having a competition to see whose is better. So I had to design 2 babka recipes. So I did a chocolate one, I did the cinnamon one, and then one of the testers came back and said, "There's one problem with the recipe for the cinnamon babka. You forgot to include cinnamon in the recipe." And I sat in there, I just forgot to, like, write it in there, I don't know how. So that's why we have these editors and testers to tell us what we got wrong.
That's pretty funny. But yes, this is what editors are for. What else do you think people get wrong when they're writing recipes and we're writing about food?
I think sometimes, well, first of all, people are tempted to lapse into the same cliches about food. I think also, sometimes food writers are very into this kind of, overwriting about food, the sort of like lavish praise of, of it rather than really getting into what is it like. So not trying to make the food look good or trying to make the food look bad, but just what are the qualities of the food? And that's really important, particularly in terms of a recipe, because how long should you bake it for or roast it for? Like, there's a time guide, but the time guide is elastic. What are you looking for is more important. Like, bake until golden brown or slightly golden brown at the edges, for example, something like. So, yeah, so I think that's a place often where food can get wrong, and I see it. I also see it in, fiction writers writing about food. Like, they tend to kind of like rhapsodize and describe it in these sort of like lofty, elevated terms rather than just dealing with it frankly and head on. Like, what kind of food is it? And like, how does it function in this world that these characters are encountering?
So, what you're saying is if you're writing about food, either fiction or nonfiction, be direct and be specific.
Yes. I'll never forget the first assignment I had in my food writing class at NYU. I studied with this chef cookbook author, Corinne Trong, and she said, we had to pick a fresh food item. So I picked a lemon because I love lemon. Like, if I had to choose between a lemon flavored dessert and a chocolate dessert, it's going to be lemon every time. I was a huge lemon lover. And so our homework was to go and get a lemon and to look at it for an hour, to really look at it. And, we could slice it open, look at the inside, look at the outside, uh, like, if you had a lemon, you might just think, "Oh, lemon's yellow." But if you actually look at the surface of a lemon, like, there's a variety of colors. There's even, like, there might be a little green on the stem end where it was picked. There might be some, flecks of orange or, like, a blush of pink. There might be little, dirt marks there. So, it's more than just like it's a yellow oblong fruit. And then also there's the different qualities of the different parts of the fruit. Like, there's the zest, then there's the pith, there's the flesh in the middle. There's the seeds. There's the ribs. I mean, there's so many different parts there, and we can just in our sort of like 2 minute or 2 second attention span culture that we live in, we could just gloss over those things that are so important. And so to really sit down, take the time to really look deeply. I think it was Gustave Flaubert, the French novelist, who said anything gets interesting if you look at it long enough. and hard enough. And so if something is not interesting, it just means you haven't looked at it with enough attention.
I don't think I'm ever gonna look at a lemon the same way again. My other me is goal strategist and author of books on goal setting. I feel like we should make a goal to pick some sort of something food wise and stare at it for an hour. Okay,
Yeah.
we'll never do that. Even 15 minutes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, I do this actually as a writing assignment for my students. I'll bring in almonds and craisins, things like that, blueberries. And I'll say, pick out a blueberry from the pint of blueberries. And I want you to look at it for 1 minute. And a lot of times these are students who are like, Generation Z, 18, 19, talk about short attention spans. And they often blush, they giggle, they get a little embarrassed. It's a very vulnerable thing to do. Food is about more than food. And then I tell them, imagine at the end of this minute, I'm going to ask you to put that blueberry back in the pint of blueberries and you have to find it again. Would you be able to? And so they really, really look at it. And then I have them eat it. And again, I say, I want you to eat it over the course of a full minute. Don't just chomp it down and really pay attention. What is the taste of that first bite of flavor? And then how does the taste and the texture change as you start, mashing on that blueberry and turning it from that initial burst and breaking it down? And then as it goes down, what's the aftertaste that it leaves behind? And this is what professional chefs are really attuned to. They know these various steps. And of course, someone who comes into a restaurant, is not like eating in that way, but unconsciously they're picking up all of this stuff. And so chefs are really thinking about like, how do I play off these various things to create what like a casual consumer would just say, oh, that was really good. But there's been a lot of planning and architecture to create that experience.
There feels like it's a lesson to slow down and eat the blueberries, which, by the way, I will also never look at the same way again. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
What can people learn from this and apply to their life?
Mm, mm. I think again that we tend to rush past all the things that are the most important. So I published a novel last year called Hotel Cuba, which is based on my grandparents' immigration story, particularly my grandmother who fled from the Russian Revolution. She tried to get to the United States, couldn't get in, and instead spent a year in Havana, Cuba. And it was fascinating to me to imagine her coming from, escaping like World War One, the pogroms, the Russian Revolution, crossing the Atlantic, and then coming from this like wintry landlocked shtetl to Havana, Cuba, where everything was like tropical and bright, and I went there and experienced the light and all of this. Um, so we're very lucky we have these recorded interviews of my grandparents telling their immigration stories. What's fascinating to me is that they barely mentioned the big historical stuff that they lived through. There was like almost no mention of politics or communism or immigration law. You know what my grandfather was obsessed with? My grandmother was trying to teach her sister how to cook. Her sister was not a very good cook, and she was trying to teach her. She was trying to teach her to make potato soup. But her sister, in perhaps her nervousness or her haste, mixed up the potatoes and the horseradish. So my grandfather, and by the way, this is 50 years later that he's telling this story, is irate. Who does that? Can you believe she mixed up the potatoes and the horseradish? I mean, what is wrong with her? Oh, you should have tasted. It was disgusting. I mean, he's going on and on about this terrible soup that, his sister-in-law had made. And it drove home a really important point for me, which is we don't experience, you know, grand movements of history on the sort of elevated, abstract level. We really are going about our days and we're thinking about what am I going to get to eat? Is it going to be any good? Will I have a place to sleep? And like, will I be tired? And do I have clothes? And do I have, a roof over my head? And do I have money? And can I get more? These sort of basic daily needs. It's how we live most of our lives. And that's how we remember, I think, a lot of the important parts of our lives. So to the extent that we distract ourselves with some of these sort of grander, larger, ideas, we're actually missing what is a very important part of it, which is our daily lived experience.
Do you remember your earliest food memory?
I remember this is really fascinating, actually. So when I was very young, my family took me to Israel. Actually, we have some distant cousins who live there. It's actually with my mom's direct cousin, I would say. And I remember she made these cookies, and they were like buttery and sugary. It was a kind of shortbread, and I just remember the flavor, the butter and the vanilla and the sugar. It was so pungent, it was so special. I always wanted to like go back and get more of those cookies, and I never could. I never got a bite of them. And also, I remember that my grandmother in Michigan, she would make this macaroni, which had three ingredients. I think this tells something about me: butter, sugar, and pasta. And I thought it was like the best macaroni ever. And I would eat it cold, I would eat it hot, like it didn't matter. Like just thought it was like the most amazing thing ever. So maybe that's where I developed my sweet tooth was all these sugary comfort foods that I was served as a little kid.
I was going to ask you what your favorite food is to eat and to cook or bake, because I'm guessing it's going to be a dessert.
Well, so I am sort of known as kind of a cookie maven. So I make a lot of cookies during the holiday time every year. We throw a huge cookie party where I bake, you know, one year I actually made, I think about 50 different kinds of cookies and I think about 100 or so in each batch. And then it's just kind of like, it's an open house. We invite people over and just a time to like acknowledge people who touched my life in the past year in various ways, to mix and meet each other. And so my tennis friends and my writing friends and my family friends and my political friends, they all sort of like mix and meet. And it's amazing, these unlikely, friendships that result. But I love to collect cookie recipes and, try all different kinds. And interestingly, I got into this because I have a friend who's a poet who is a cookie baker, and she used to make cookies every year for Christmas. And I said, "Oh, can I shadow you, and just see how you do it and what you make?" And then it became like an annual thing. Like every, year during the holidays, we'd get together and make our recipes together. And then I moved away from New York, where we both lived at the time, and I moved to Washington D.C., where I now live. And I said, "Well, maybe I'll just keep up the tradition, on my own." And then it just sort of mushroomed and grew out of there. But cookies, I find, are like a really expressive canvas. You can flavor them in so many different ways. You can do so many different textures, so many different decorations, so many colors, flavors. There's just so many different ways you can take them. I think like almost anything can be made into a cookie, and you can also take them in a savory direction too. Some amazing savory cookies that I've made over the years. You can go gluten free, you can go dairy free. I mean, there's just so many different things you can do. It's very elastic. I mean, I love cake too, but cake is like project. It's like a commitment. And cookies are just like this fun experiment, and also very forgiving, I find. So I really enjoy playing around in the kitchen with cookies.
I think that was a really great differentiation because cake is a project
Yeah. Yeah.
and cookies. Wow. I've never wished I lived in DC more than I do at this particular moment in time. In what way do you think your Jewishness has impacted your relationship with food and cooking and your career?
Well, it's definitely informed it in all kinds of ways. I mean, just thinking about the food, there's a lot of food that I grew up with and sort of took for granted as being sort of staple foods for everyone. And then as I got older, I realized, no, these are particularly, Jewish foods, for example. So one piece that I did that I think is very informed by this is a piece I wrote about 7-layer cake, which I don't know if listeners are familiar with it, but it's kind of like a sponge cake that is cut into these layers. And then there's sort of like I would describe it as kind of like a mocha-ish uh, chocolatey cream in between, and like that sort of chocolate ganache that goes over the top. And it was always something that you would get at like a bakery, at a Jewish bakery. I never realized. realized that that was something you could actually like just make at home. It never even occurred to me that you could until like one day I was actually visiting my mom in Detroit and I was like, why couldn't I just make this at home? I get a crate. I would only get it in Detroit when I was visiting her and, get it from these Jewish bakeries. So I started doing research into the history of this cake. And it turned out that its roots are actually Hungarian and that Jewish baking from like Eastern Europe, which is where my family, came from, and many families came from like the Pale of Settlement. Some years with Poland, some years was Russia. It was very homey. It was very not elaborate, let's say, very simple, very, kind of peasant food. And so when those people wanted to sort of dress up or formalize something, they would go to like a Hungarian pastry or Austro-Hungarian pastry because that was more sort of elevated, and the seven-layer cake adopted there. It's actually a relative of a dobos cake. And so it was just fascinating to me that this cake that I'd taken for granted had this whole history behind it. And that's what's exciting to me about food are the layers of history that are embedded within it. And as a writer, like I'm always looking for how can I talk about again, this is a theme is echoing here. How can I talk about these bigger, larger things within the realm of something that I can see, taste, touch, smell, even hear, something that's very on the ground, something that's very that I can literally put into my body. Our relationship with food is just so intimate when you think about it that way. You're literally taking something and putting it inside your body. So, I think food is a great way to kind of ground these sort of abstractions of history. Another piece that also reflects this is that when my father died, so my father in his final years, he liked to go fishing when he was a kid. And when he retired, he went back to fishing. And he would catch this fish in Lake St. Clair near Detroit. And my mom would use it to make gefilte fish. And then when he died, we had like one more year of this fish that she had frozen. And then I wrote a piece about how the first year she made the gefilte fish without my father's fish. And, kind of remembering the past of him, his hand being there, and also remembering her mother, whose recipe the gefilte fish was. And so there are all these layers of history that were embedded within that story of just a simple gefilte fish recipe. So I think it informs everything that I do.
Layered just like a cake.
Yes.
My mother was from Detroit,
Huh?
and she was always raving about it, how much she loves seven-layer cake, and now I know why. So, thank you.
And now you can
Um,
make it with my recipe.
I can, it'll be bittersweet because she's no longer with us, so she can't enjoy it, but I'm sure I will hear her voice in my head while eating it saying, "See, this is why I love this dessert so much."
Exactly, exactly. In a way, food is a way of keeping those who are no longer with us. It brings them back for a moment, in our minds and in our hearts. The senses are memory carriers, It's funny, there's this object in the Harry Potter series. It's called a port key. It's an object that if the characters touch it, it whisks them away to like another place in time. And food is like that kind of port key that exists in our lives. And again, thinking of that quote from Flaubert, anything gets interesting if you look at it long enough. If you really focus, you may find that the foods that you naturally gravitate to, and also the foods maybe that you stay away from, they may have history tied within them, a really rich history. And I think examining it just makes your life all that more fulfilling.
I love this. And I've had a lot of conversations about food. I feel like this philosophically is probably one of the deepest ones. And I thank you so much, Aaron Hamburger, for joining me. Where can people learn more about you and your writing and your books?
Well, I would say the first place to go is aaronhamburger.com, which has links to various essays that I've written, and also all my books are reflected there as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. Thank you for tuning in to Taste Buds with Deb. Don't miss an episode. You can subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, and or your favorite podcast platform. And if you go to jewishjournal.com/podcast, You'll read the articles and get the recipes. We're going to surprise you with this one. Will it be cake? Will it be a cookie? You will have to go look at the website and find out. And you can learn more at tastebudswithdeb.com. So take a moment, look at your food, really look at it, and then enjoy it. Until next time, bon appetit.